All right, so um, we're going to dive into the making of Thor: The Dark World.
Okay.
And you guys have given us like a really fascinating mix of sources for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We have some DVD commentary from the filmmakers.
Mm-hmm.
We have a YouTube video essay that actually defends Thor: The Dark World,
Interesting.
and even some background info from Wikipedia.
Okay.
I'm already intrigued, to
I
be
think
honest.
it's a pretty unique combination of sources.
Yeah.
It'll allow us to kind of look at Thor: The Dark World from all these different angles. We'll
Yeah.
get like behind the scenes info.
Mm-hmm.
We'll get some like real in-depth critical analysis.
Yeah.
And then we'll also just get the straight facts from Wikipedia.
Yeah, and I have a feeling this might challenge some preconceived notions about this film.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Before we get into the specifics, I have to ask, were you surprised to see someone passionately defending Thor: The Dark World?
I wasn't that surprised.
Yeah.
Every film has its fans. And I think Thor: The Dark World definitely has its strengths. It's really interesting to consider why this YouTuber connects with it so strongly and how their perspective might challenge the more common criticisms of the film.
Okay, so let's start from the beginning.
Okay.
The first Thor was a success, but apparently Marvel Studios head Kevin Feige was already thinking about a sequel,
Wow.
even before it hit theaters.
He was confident. Yeah, it seems like he really saw the potential for Thor's story to expand.
Yeah.
And I think he was eager to explore the cosmic side of the Marvel universe even further.
Yeah.
Seems like he had a pretty clear vision for where he wanted to take these characters, even in those early days.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah.
Okay, so initially director Kenneth Branagh was on board for the sequel,
Okay.
but he ultimately decided to step away.
Yeah.
Was it simply the quick turnaround time for the script, or were there other factors at play?
I mean, the tight schedule probably played a role.
Yeah.
But Branagh has also said that he wanted to move on to other projects. He felt like he had told the story he wanted to tell with the first Thor.
Right.
And was ready for some new challenges. And
Yeah.
so that kind of opened the door for a new director to come in and put their own stamp on the sequel.
And that director was Alan Taylor, who was known for his work on Game of Thrones,
Oh, yeah,
a show with a very distinct visual style.
definitely.
Did he bring that same aesthetic to Thor: The Dark World?
He absolutely did.
All right.
Taylor wanted to create a more grounded and gritty Asgard,
Okay.
which is a stark contrast to the polished, almost ethereal look of the first film.
Yeah.
He envisioned a dirty aesthetic,
Interesting.
emphasizing the Viking roots of Thor and Norse mythology.
Okay.
And he really leaned into using handheld camera work to try to create a more visceral, almost documentary-like feel.
So that's a pretty significant shift in tone.
Yeah, for sure.
Was this a conscious decision to differentiate the sequel from its predecessor?
It seems
Right.
so. Taylor wanted to kind of explore a different side of Asgard, one that felt more lived in and less like a pristine fantasy world. He saw Asgard as a place with a rich history and a complex culture,
Right.
and he wanted to reflect that in the film's visuals.
Okay.
He felt the first film was too shiny,
Okay.
and he wanted to ground Asgard more in reality.
So it sounds like Taylor was really trying to make Thor: The Dark World his own,
Yeah.
visually and tonally.
He was.
But we do know that studio interference is a common occurrence in big-budget films.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Did Taylor have complete creative control over his vision?
It's worth noting that Taylor has said in interviews that he wasn't entirely satisfied with the final cut of the film.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he felt the studio made some pretty significant changes in post-production,
Yeah.
which is something that can happen when you're dealing with a franchise as big as the MCU.
Right, because they have to make sure that everything kind of fits into the bigger picture.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the overall aesthetic and some behind-the-scenes dynamics. So let's talk about the story itself.
Okay.
This time around, Thor is facing a new threat, the Dark Elves, and their leader, Malekith,
Yes.
played by Christopher Eccleston.
Right, and these dark elves are beings that predate even Asgard, and they seek to plunge the universe into darkness using a weapon called the Ether.
The Aether. Okay.
And this is important for the larger MCU, is actually one of the Infinity Stones.
Wait, the Aether is an Infinity Stone?
It is.
That's a pretty big deal.
It's a big deal. It's the Reality Stone, to be precise.
Okay.
And its appearance in Thor: The Dark World ties directly into the overarching narrative of the Infinity Saga.
So that's how this movie ties into the bigger picture.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
The film doesn't explicitly explain all of this.
Right.
Which might be why some viewers missed its significance.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's easy to kind of get caught up in the immediate story.
Yeah.
And miss those subtle connections to the larger MCU tapestry.
For sure.
So Thor is facing a cosmic level threat, even more so than he realizes. How does this impact his character arc in the film?
Well, in this film, Thor's grappling with the weight of responsibility, preparing to potentially take the throne of Asgard. He's also dealing with the fallout of Loki's actions in the Avengers.
Yeah.
And navigating the complexities of their relationship.
Right.
And now on top of all that, he's facing an enemy that threatens the very fabric of reality.
That's a lot for one god to handle.
It is.
And speaking of Loki, he's back, of course.
Yes.
Played by Tom Hiddleston.
Yes.
What is his role in all of this? Is he still the mischievous trickster? Or has he undergone some kind of transformation?
That's a great question, and it's one that the YouTuber we're discussing focuses on quite a bit.
Oh.
They argue that Thor the Dark World actually gives Loki a more nuanced and complex arc than some of the later films.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to hear more about that.
Yeah.
But before we dive into the YouTuber's take, I want to get a sense of the filmmaking process.
Oh.
Were there any particular challenges or interesting anecdotes from the production that stand out?
There are a few.
Okay.
Christopher Eccleston, who played Malekith, actually had a pretty grueling experience with the makeup process.
Oh.
It took hours each day to transform him into the Dark Elf leader.
That's intense.
Yeah, it was intense.
But I imagine the visual impact was worth it.
Oh, it was.
Okay.
The Dark Elves have a very distinctive look.
Yeah.
And the makeup and prosthetics played a big role in creating that.
Yeah.
Eccleston also had to speak an entirely invented language for the film.
Why?
Which added another layer of complexity to his performance.
Wow, that's dedication.
It is.
And speaking of details, did you catch that subtle homage to The Great Escape?
Oh, yeah?
When Loki is tossing the cup in his prison cell?
I did.
It's a nod to Steve McQueen's iconic character.
It's a clever little Easter egg for film buffs.
Yeah.
And it kind of speaks to Loki's playful nature, even in confinement.
Right.
He's always looking for a way to entertain himself, even if it's at the expense of his guards.
It's those little touches that add depth and personality to a film.
Yeah, they do.
But let's get back to that YouTuber's defense of Loki's arc in Thor the Dark World.
Okay.
What exactly are they arguing?
They claim that the Dark World allows us to see a more vulnerable side of Loki.
Okay.
He's forced to confront the consequences of his actions, and we see him grapple with grief and loss in a way that we haven't seen before.
Okay, I'm starting to see their point.
Yeah. But didn't Loki die in this film?
Yeah.
How can he have a complex arc if he's not even around for most of it?
That's where things get interesting. Yeah, that's where the discussion of Loki's role in this movie gets really interesting. And remember, this deep dive is based on materials you provided.
Right.
And this YouTuber, whose essay we are discussing, is adamant that Thor the Dark World shows a level of depth in Loki's character that later films, especially Thor Ragnarok, simply gloss over.
Okay, so remind me what happens at the end of this film.
Oh, yeah. It's been a while since I've seen it.
So it appears that Loki dies,
Right.
heroically helping Thor.
Right.
But then in a twist, we see him impersonating Odin on the throne of Asgard.
Right, yeah.
And this isn't just like a mischievous prank.
Yeah.
This YouTuber argues that this is a culmination of Loki's desire for power and recognition stemming from his complicated relationship with his family.
Okay, but doesn't Thor Ragnarok address that family dynamic?
It does.
We see Loki and Thor team up against Hela, their older sister?
Yes, but the YouTuber contends that Ragnarok frames their dynamic more for comedic effect,
Okay.
undermining the emotional weight of their conflict established in the Dark World.
Okay.
They even point to the scene in Ragnarok where Thor and Loki reenact the events of the Dark World as a cheesy play, almost mocking the previous film's seriousness.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
It's almost like Ragnarok is trying to distance itself from the tone and themes of the Dark World.
Exactly. The YouTuber sees this as a deliberate creative choice, a shift toward a more lighthearted and comedic approach.
Yeah.
That, in their opinion, sacrifices character development for cheap laughs.
Right.
And they argue that this undermines the progress Loki made in the Dark World,
Okay.
essentially resetting him to a more one-dimensional trickster.
So essentially the YouTuber's arguing that Thor, the Dark World, despite its flaws,
Yes.
took Loki's character in a direction that subsequent films chose to ignore or even actively reverse.
Precisely.
Okay.
They believe that the Dark World offered a glimpse of a more mature and introspective Loki.
Okay.
A Loki capable of genuine change and sacrifice.
Yeah.
And that's a perspective worth considering even if you ultimately disagree with it.
I'm with you on that. It's always fascinating to hear passionate defenses of films that are often dismissed or overlooked.
I agree.
It forces you to re-examine your own assumptions and look for those hidden layers of meaning.
For sure.
Speaking of layers, the YouTuber's essay also criticizes how Jane Foster is portrayed in the Dark World, but specifically her lack of agency.
It's something we touched on earlier,
Yeah.
but it's worth exploring further.
Okay, remind me what their specific criticism is.
Oh, yeah.
I know Jane becomes a host for the Aether.
Yes.
But how does that diminish her agency?
So the YouTuber argues that Jane, despite being this brilliant scientist, essentially becomes like a passive vessel for the Aether's power.
Okay.
She loses control of her own body and actions becoming a pawn in the conflict between Thor and the Dark Elves.
Right.
And they argue that this reduces Jane to like a damsel in distress trope.
Okay.
Which undercuts her character development from the first Thor film.
Okay, I see their point. It's one thing for Jane to be in danger. It's another for her to be completely stripped of her autonomy.
Right. And the YouTuber connects this to broader criticisms of how female characters are often treated in action-adventure films.
Okay.
They point out that this tendency to sideline female characters, even those with established intelligence and skills, reinforces harmful gender stereotypes.
Yeah, that's a really thought-provoking argument. It makes you wonder if those creative choices were conscious decisions or simply unconscious biases creeping into the storytelling.
It's a question worth asking.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the importance of like critical analysis when engaging with any form of media. Even films within a franchise, as seemingly lighthearted as the MCU, can carry underlying messages and potentially problematic representations.
It's a good reminder to be aware of those subtle influences and to engage with media critically.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about the YouTuber's critiques of Loki's arc and Jane's agency.
Right.
What other points do they raise in their defense of Thor the Dark World?
One of their main arguments is that The Dark World, despite its flaws, is a visually stunning film.
Okay.
They highlight Alan Taylor's masterful use of color and composition, particularly the way he contrasts the warm golden hues of Asgard with the colder, bluer tones of Earth and Svartalfheim, the realm of the Dark Elves.
Yes, I remember being blown away by those visuals.
Oh, yeah.
Especially the scene where Thor is battling across the 9 realms during the convergence.
Yeah.
It felt so epic and otherworldly.
It did.
And the YouTuber praises how those visuals aren't just for spectacle.
Right.
They actually enhance the storytelling.
They do.
For example, they point out how the warm colors associated with Asgard reflect a sense of history and tradition.
Yeah.
While the colder tones of Svartalfheim create a sense of foreboding and danger.
Exactly.
That's interesting. I never consciously thought about it that way, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like the visuals are creating a subconscious emotional response in the viewer.
Exactly. And it shows how much thought and care went into the film's visual language.
Yeah.
It's not just about creating pretty pictures. It's about using those images to tell a story and evoke specific emotions.
And the YouTuber isn't alone in praising the visuals. Even critics who weren't entirely sold on the film acknowledged the impressive visual effects.
Right.
And the stunning depiction of the various realms.
Yeah. The visual effects team really pushed the boundaries of what was possible at the time, seamlessly blending practical sets with CGI to create these breathtaking landscapes.
I remember reading that they even used real footage of the Norwegian coast to create some of the backdrops for Asgard.
That's cool.
It's those little details that add a layer of realism to the fantasy.
It's those details that elevate the film and create a more immersive experience for the viewer.
Speaking of details, one thing that struck me while rewatching the film was the scene in the London warehouse where the kids are playing with the gravity anomalies. Did you catch that they were all speaking Farsi?
I did. It's a subtle detail, but it speaks to the filmmaker's desire to create a sense of global interconnectedness.
Right.
Even amidst these fantastical events.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that the impact of these cosmic forces is felt not just in Asgard or America, but everywhere.
It's a nice touch that adds a layer of realism and diversity to the film's world. But let's get back to the YouTuber's overall assessment of Thor the Dark World.
Okay.
If they acknowledge its flaws, why are they so passionate about defending it?
Well, I think it comes down to their belief that the film, despite its imperfections, is unfairly dismissed by many fans and critics.
Okay.
They see it as a film that tried to do something different with the Thor mythology.
Okay.
To explore darker themes and more complex character dynamics.
And they feel like Thor Ragnarok, while entertaining, took a step back from that complexity.
Exactly.
Sacrificing substance for style and humor.
Right. And while not everyone will agree with that assessment, it's a valid perspective that deserves to be considered.
I agree. It's all about having those open conversations and challenging our own preconceived notions.
Definitely.
Speaking of challenging notions, one thing that surprised me while researching for this deep dive was that Loki wasn't originally supposed to survive Thor the Dark World.
Oh, that is interesting. Tell me more about that.
Yeah.
What led to the change?
Yeah. So before we were talking about how Loki wasn't originally supposed to survive Thor the Dark World.
Right.
That seems like a pretty major change.
Yeah, it is.
What happened?
Well, according to the DVD commentary, you provided test audiences reacted very emotionally to Loki's apparent demise.
Wow.
So much so that Marvel decided to actually rewrite the ending, giving us that surprising reveal of Loki on the Asgardian throne.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that audience feedback can sometimes directly impact a film's narrative.
For sure.
Makes you wonder what other creative choices were influenced by test screenings or studio notes.
It's something we can only speculate about.
Yeah.
But it definitely highlights like the collaborative nature of filmmaking. It's not always like a singular vision. It's often a process of negotiation and compromise.
And sometimes those compromises lead to unexpected outcomes.
Definitely.
Both positive and negative.
Right.
Speaking of outcomes.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear your take on those end credit scenes in Thor the Dark World.
Okay.
We have the scene with the Collector, which sets up Guardians of the Galaxy, and then the scene with Thor returning to Earth and reuniting with Jane.
Right. Those scenes kind of serve a dual purpose, both narratively and strategically.
Okay.
On the one hand, they offer like a glimpse into the future of the MCU, enticing audiences to stick around and see what's next. But they also, as Kevin Feige himself has admitted, serve as a way to encourage viewers to appreciate the hard work of everyone involved in making the film. By watching the full credits roll.
Wait, Kevin Feige actually said that?
He did.
What was his reasoning behind that?
He explained that he was inspired by watching Ferris Bueller's Day Off as a kid.
Oh, wow.
And he realized that those names scrolling by weren't just random words. They represented real people who had poured their time and talent into creating the film.
Yeah.
And he wanted to encourage audiences to recognize and appreciate those contributions.
That's a really thoughtful perspective.
It is.
It's easy to forget that filmmaking is such a collaborative art form.
Yeah.
Involving hundreds of individuals working behind the scenes.
For sure. And those end credit scenes beyond their narrative function serve as a subtle reminder of that collaborative effort.
Okay, so Thor, the Dark World, clearly had its impact on the larger MCU.
Yes.
Both in terms of setting up future storylines and subtly promoting the importance of recognizing the work of everyone involved.
Right.
But I have to ask, how did the film itself fare critically?
Okay.
You've discussed the YouTuber's passionate defense, but what was the general consensus?
You know, it was kind of a mixed bag, honestly.
Okay.
The film currently holds a 66% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes.
Okay.
Which is on the lower end for MCU films.
So not exactly a critical darling.
Not really.
What were the main points of praise and criticism?
Most critics praise the performances, particularly Hemsworth and Hiddleston.
Right.
Their chemistry is undeniable, and they bring a certain charm and gravitas to their roles. The visual effects were also generally well received, especially the depiction of the various realms and the epic battle sequences.
That makes sense. The visuals were definitely a highlight for me as well.
Yeah.
But what about the negative reviews? What were the main criticisms?
A common criticism was that the villain Malekith felt underdeveloped and lacked the compelling motivations we've seen in other MCU villains.
Yeah.
Some critics also felt the plot was a bit convoluted and that it lacked the emotional depth of other Marvel films.
That's interesting. It seems like the film's emotional depth, or lack thereof, is a real point of contention.
Yeah. It is.
The YouTuber we've been discussing clearly feels strongly about the emotional weight of Loki's arc.
Right.
And the film's exploration of those complex family dynamics.
Yeah, it just goes to show that interpretations can vary wildly, and what resonates with one viewer might fall flat for another. Yeah. It's all subjective. And ultimately, the experience of watching a film is shaped by our individual perspectives, preferences,
right,
and even our mood at the time.
So true.
Yeah.
But one thing that's not subjective is box office performance.
Right.
And in that regard, Thor the Dark World was a definite success.
It was.
It grossed over $644 million worldwide.
Wow.
Surpassing the box office performance of the first Thor film.
Yes, financially the film was a hit.
It was.
Which makes the decision to drastically change the tone and style in Thor Ragnarok all the more intriguing.
I wonder if Marvel Studios felt like they needed to shake things up after the mixed reception of the Dark World.
Yeah.
Or if they simply wanted to take Thor's character in a new direction.
It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
But it's clear that Thor Ragnarok marked a turning point.
Yeah.
For the character and for the franchise as a whole.
And maybe that's why Thor the Dark World feels somewhat forgotten in the grand scheme of the MCU.
Yeah, maybe.
It's sandwiched between the more serious Shakespearean Thor and the wildly comedic Ragnarok.
Yeah.
Almost like it's trying to find its own identity.
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
It's a film that perhaps hasn't quite found its place in the ever-expanding Marvel universe.
Right.
But as we've seen in this deep dive, it's a film worth revisiting.
Yeah.
A film with its own unique strengths and a perspective that challenges conventional wisdom.
I completely agree. I went into this deep dive with some preconceived notions about Thor the Dark World.
Yeah.
But after exploring these sources and discussing them with you, I have a newfound appreciation for the film.
That's great.
It might not be a perfect film.
Yeah.
But it's a film that sparks interesting conversations.
It does.
And makes you think about the larger context of the MCU.
For sure. And that's what makes these deep dives so rewarding.
Yeah.
It's not just about summarizing information. It's about exploring different perspectives, challenging our own assumptions, and ultimately deepening our understanding of the subject matter.
Well said. And to our listeners, we leave you with this thought.
Okay.
Knowing what we now know about the making of Thor the Dark World, its mixed critical reception, and the passionate arguments made by fans, does this film deserve a reevaluation? Or is Ragnarok's comedic reboot the superior direction for the franchise?
It's a good question.
We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning.
Yes.
And keep diving deep.